Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this evening, braving this apocalyptic weather we have. But I'm so happy you're here. So again, my name is Alyssa Miller, and I am the dramaturg for Cyrano De Bergerac. I am also a PhD student in the Department of English here at CU Boulder. So I am one of the happy beneficiaries of the collaborative relationship between the university and the Colorado Shakespeare Festival. I again want to extend my thanks to the Boulder Public Library for hosting us. And this is part of a lecture series. We've already had two. We have one more, as Heidi mentioned. So how many of you have been to one of these before? Oh, great. OK, how many of you is this is your first dramaturgy talk? Wow, great. OK, so a lot of returning faces and some new ones. Awesome. Well, I would also be remiss if I didn't let you know that we are joined tonight by our illustrious director, Christopher Duvall. You guys may recognize, big round of applause for Chris. It's very nice of him to be here. It's our day off, so it's his one day of the week. He doesn't have to think about the show, but he's here, so thank you, Chris. You might recognize him from last year. He directed The Taming of the Shrew, which also starred Scott Coopwood, who is playing Cyrano de Bergerac in our production. And Chris comes to us from the University of Utah, where he is the head of the actor training program and teaches lots of classes in acting, directing, fight choreography, and movement. He has worked as a professional actor, director, and fight choreographer all across the country at various Shakespeare festivals and other notable theater companies. And in addition to being a certified teacher with the Society of American Fight Directors, Chris also holds a second-degree black belt in Aikido. So you really don't want to cross Chris. No, but I could spend the next 45 minutes singing Chris's praises, but suffice it to say, he is a tremendous talent to have in our room, and it's a privilege to learn from him as we rehearse. So we're 1 week into our rehearsals, and it's a very exciting time to be talking about this play with you. And I have to say, what an amazing opportunity to get to share our research and our artistic thoughts about the play with the community and with the people who are actually going to be there to see it. So thanks to the Colorado Shakespeare Festival for sponsoring these events, and thank you all to you for executing and being here. But some of the new people who haven't been to a dramaturgy talk might be asking, well, what is a dramaturgy talk? What is a dramaturg? What is a dramaturg? Anybody know? Yeah.
They always tell us it's a bridge.
A bridge between
The play, the director, the actor.
Yeah, a bridge. That's a really good sort of metaphor, a sort of liaison of the history and, I guess, textual detail of a show, and then the actual performance that happens. So the way that I like to think about what a dramaturg does, so you get into a rehearsal room, and everybody who's entering the room has a very specific angle through which they're viewing the show. Your director is looking at the staging and how actors are arranged on stage and that, the whole design is okay. The set designer is making sure that the set looks all right, and the lighting designer, et cetera. An actor is thinking about their through line for their character every time they enter and exit a scene. But in all of that, it can sometimes be a little hard to keep track of the big picture. And I think that's where the dramaturg comes in. A dramaturg is the eyes on the storytelling in the room to make sure that we're telling our version of the story as clearly and effectively as possible. And so a dramaturg gets to wear a lot of hats and work across lots of different artistic departments, which is a lot of fun for me. But I've been working on this show with Chris since about November or December of last year. And one of the first tasks of a dramaturg is to prepare the script for the actors. So like many Shakespeare plays, this play in full would run about 4.5 hours if we didn't cut it. We are more merciful than that. So we have prepared a version of our script, which is actually a translation. We'll talk about translation work. And that involves, making decisions, what gets to stay and what has to go. And then I go back and I compile a bunch of research to present to the cast to sort of help fill out the show. And then, again, I get to be the eyes on the storytelling in the room. So in such a historically dense show, I find it really helpful to divide my research into what I call the 4 dramaturgical locations. And so the first one is when and where the play was written. So Cyrano de Bergerac was written in 1896. It was performed in 1897 by Edmond Rostand in Paris, France. The second location is when and where the play is set. It is set in the years 1640 and 1655 in Paris. The third location is when and where we are performing the play, so of course the Colorado Shakespeare Festival in 2018. And the fourth location is when and where we are setting our production. And this is important because oftentimes a new production will choose a different setting than the original one. But our production is setting the play in the original time and place of the setting, which is 1640 and 1655 in Paris. And I bring this up because this will sort of provide a chronological roadmap to direct where we'll be going in this evening's talk. So to give you a little overview of what you're about to hear in the next, I'll get you out of here before 7:30, so 30 minutes or so. We'll talk a little bit about the history of France during the Renaissance, which is when this play takes place. So we'll start in 1640. We'll then jump forward to Edmond Rostand's time and talk about what was going on in Paris when he was writing the play. And then, of course, once the play premiered, it has a long and notable production history that carries us right through to today and to our production, which is opening in 3 weeks. So up on the left, you'll see some ladies of high esteem. They're from the Belle Époque, which is an era of artistic and historical, a Western historical and artistic movement that's usually dated between the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871 and the outbreak of World War I in 1914. So that's right when Rostand was writing the drama. A little bit of a different look. Does anybody recognize that building? I'll give you a clue. It's in Paris. It's the Louvre, exactly. Now, of course, if you've been to Paris or you've seen pictures, we recognize the big triangle in front of the Louvre. But this was actually the royal palace before it was a museum. And this was the royal palace of King Louis VIII, who was the reigning monarch during the time when Cyrano de Bergerac was set. So there you go, a little bit of a taste of two locations we're interested in. So Cyrano de Bergerac, how many of you have seen a version of this story before? Almost everyone. Look around. That's a lot, right? There's plays, there's an opera, a musical, lots of adaptations. But for those of you who might be unfamiliar with the story, Cyrano de Bergerac follows the story of a man named Cyrano de Bergerac, who is a Renaissance man extraordinaire. He is a poet and a brilliant swordsman and a musician and just so incredibly eloquent and witty. He's truly a genius. But he also has a big mouth and a big ego, which gets him into trouble, and an unfortunately big nose, which of course is his biggest downfall in the end. So Cyrano is pining after his cousin Roxanne, who does not know that he's in love with him, that he's in love with her, and of course he is embarrassed to tell her. He thinks she will laugh at him, which is in his mind the absolute worst thing that could ever happen. And so then in comes Christian de Neuvillette, who is a young new soldier who joins the army and actually happens to be in Cyrano's regiment. And Christian has a beautiful face and is everything Roxanne is looking for, but Christian is a little dim-witted and not so good on the poetry. And Roxanne grew up in a very high-class society, so she really loves words and literature. So rather than not love Roxanne at all, Cyrano decides that he would rather love her via surrogate. And so he convinces Christian to borrow his wit, as he says, and woo Roxanne with Cyrano's words. So Christian pretends to be speaking, and of course it's really Cyrano's heart and soul in the words. Roxanne, of course, never finds out, and the plot goes along well for a while. So we'll start there. This is the cover page of the first printing of Cyrano de Bergerac, of course in French, in 1898. And this is an advertisement for an early production of the play in Paris. So lights up on Act 1, and we are in the Théâtre de l'Hôtel Bourgogne, which was actually a historical theater in Paris. And I want to put this sketch up here. It's obviously a sketch, this is not a photograph from 1647. In case you were confused. But I want to put this up here because if you are familiar at all with performance practices of Shakespeare's time from previous productions here, maybe your own Shakespeare nerd out sessions, you might recognize a very similar setup to how this stage looks. So the stage is not in a thrust, which means it literally thrusts out into the audience and is surrounded by three sides, but it does sort of jut out into the audience to create a playing space. And then you have the pit where the groundlings can stand. So those are the cheap seats because you have to be on your feet all night, which might be 4.5 hours if they're doing the whole play. Then you have an area for some more upper tiered people to sit who can afford to pay for those tickets to sit down. But of course, they're not as high as the aristocracy who would be up in the galleries. And this is really important because you can visibly see people's rank just by where they were located in the theater. So the theater was a place to see a show, but also very much a place to be seen. And it's set up kind of like an arena, right? We now watch events that take place in the middle where the groundlings are. So they're really watching the audience and each other as much as the show. And that was a theater experience in the Renaissance. So very similar to Shakespeare, but of course, this is the French version. So lights up on the Hotel de Bourgogne, and everyone is eagerly awaiting the arrival of Cyrano to see if he's going to come and boot the poor actor Montfleury off the stage. We're in 1640 France, but what is going on in the world right now? So as I mentioned, King Louis VIII is the reigning monarch. He is married. That's what it says up there. You are right about that. Well, that is wrong. He's King Louis VIII was the reigning monarch, and he took the throne at the age of 9 years old in 1610. So as you can imagine, he was not maybe well equipped to make some big political decisions. So his mother, Marie de Medici, acted as his queen regent and basically ran the country alongside the Cardinal Richelieu. So Cardinal Richelieu was obviously a cardinal, a member of the Catholic order, but was a very important political figure in France at this time. And this is hugely important because it demonstrates that politics and religion were not at all separate entities, but in fact were very much one and the same in this period, which was causing a lot of conflict. And King Louis VIII, not the 13th, was married to Anne of Austria, who was a Habsburg, and that will come back into our story in a little bit. If these names sound familiar to you from another French novel, The Three Musketeers, then you're spot on. This is right in the era of Dumas' Three Musketeers. And Dumas was actually writing not long before Edmond Rostand. So kind of a similar hearkening back to the Renaissance period that was happening later in the 19th century. So a little bit of historical context of what's happening in 1640, not just in France, but all over Europe. So Europe was in the middle of a really big political and religious conflict, which pretty much started off by the posting of 95 Theses by Martin Luther in 1517, which was basically a big rhetorical argument that challenged many of the main tenets of the Roman Catholic Church. And this sparked what became known as the Protestant Reformation. So all of Europe is questioning what they believe and if everything they followed and thought was right is really what they think and believe. But of course this is complex because churches and governments are almost one and the same. So whether or not individuals want to choose a side, they oftentimes don't have a choice. I should also mention the Habsburg family was the sort of dynastic rulers of the Roman Catholic Church. They were based in Austria, not based in Austria, they were based in Bohemia, which is current-day Czech Republic. And they arranged a series of very strategic marriages during the Middle Ages that placed a Habsburg in almost every royal house all across Europe. So by the time the 30 Years' War breaks out in the 17th century, it's political, it's religious, and it's also highly personal because it's all family. And so that's why it's really kind of challenging to follow all of this history. So we're not going to get too far into it. But suffice it to say, there's all this religious upheaval, and the Roman Emperor Ferdinand II of Bohemia decides, okay, enough, we need to unify the religion, we need to make everyone who's under our reign Roman Catholic. Doesn't go over so well, and a huge war starts. So in 1618, the war breaks out, and actually doesn't really involve France for the first 2/3 of it or so. But in the last decade, France starts being implicated because France is not too happy about the idea that the Spanish and the Habsburg family might unite and create a dynasty. And France is surrounded by Habsburgs on all of their borders. So down on the southern border of France, tensions are rising with the Habsburgs, with the Habsburg family from Spain. But of course, this is complicated because King Louis VIII is married to Queen Anne of Austria, who is a Habsburg, and who is the daughter.
Excuse me, 30 Years' War ended in
Oh, I apologize. Many typos. Yes, I'm between a few centuries. Right, it did not go on for 230 years. That would be excessive. Only for 30 years, yes, 1618 to 1648. So the time that Cyrano de Bergerac takes place is right within that last decade, right when France and Spain are really getting into things. So that was France's big political move. They were trying to prevent another dynasty to take over Europe. So they get involved in the war, and that's important in our story because the Act 4, the Siege of Arras, will take us right to the front lines of the 30 Years' War. But there were also some really happy things going on during 1640. 1640, France was at the height of the Renaissance. So the word Renaissance, does anybody know what the word itself actually means? Rebirth, yeah, of course. It is from the French naissance. It means rebirth. So it is a hearkening back to classicism, a birthing of new ideas. And it really refers more generally to anywhere between the late 15th century and the mid 17th century all across Europe, and kind of hit different countries at its prime in different times. So the prime of the English Renaissance was right when Shakespeare was writing, so a little bit earlier than the French Renaissance. But in 1640, we're right at the height of the French Renaissance, and there's lots of art being made, and theater, and music, and this hearkening back to classicism means really a hearkening back to the ancient Greek and Roman philosophies and teachings as a starting point for new ideas and theories. And this became really, really prominent in scientific advancement when, again, not just the religious world was shifting on its axis, but literally the universe was turning upside down. And that was all to do with the man in the corner. Does anybody know who that is? Not Newton, but a good guess. Copernicus, Nicolaus Copernicus, who is a Polish philosopher, astronomer, mathematician, who was the very first one to posit in the early 16th century that maybe not everything revolves around the Earth, but maybe the Earth and other things revolve around the sun. That would be called a heliocentric model of the universe. Now this was radical. This really shook things up. Not only because it required a complete paradigm shift of what everybody had thought since the time of Aristotle, so again, since this classical period, but also because it was directly against any religious teachings. So it was not only, a lot to get your head around in your own space, but it was heresy to support Copernicus and his theories. Does anybody know who the man next to Copernicus is? That's Galileo, exactly. So Galileo came along after Copernicus. He was an Italian genius, savant. He really contributed to so many fields I couldn't list them all. But he was a very big supporter of Copernicus's heliocentric theory and used Copernicus's math to help many of his own calculations. And that's really important because we see some of the big thinkers that we now today look back and say, oh yes, they revolutionized the world and they got us where we are today. They were really looked down upon in their time. In fact, Galileo was tried and nearly executed for publishing some of his thoughts. Around this time, too, was the establishment of l'Académie Française, which was basically an elite rhetorical society that was created by the Cardinal Richelieu, so remember, a big religious figure, to try to standardize the French language. And this was a nationalistic move, for sure, but it was also political and also highly religious, because people were, saying whatever they wanted now, and reading whatever they wanted, and thinking whatever they wanted. But maybe if France would have a unified system of writing and reading and rhetoric that had a standard of rigor that everyone could be held to, then they could also sort of control some of the ideas that were being disseminated. So that's where l'Académie Française originates from. But it, of course, has remained a very established institution for the French nation and is still in convenes and has members today. And that will come back for our humble playwright of Cyrano de Bergerac. Do you have any questions so far? What's going on around 1640? Some good, some bad. Great, so Cyrano has convinced Christian to woo Roxane with his words, and it all goes swimmingly until the nefarious Comte de Guiche comes in and decides that he wants to take Roxane for his mistress. Roxane is not too happy about this, so she quickly thinks on her toes and devises a plan where she tricks a Capuchin to marry her to Christian, because of course as a married woman she would not be available to be a mistress to somebody else. And right after that happens, the Comte de Guiche finds out and leaves with his army, which includes Christian, Roxane's brand new husband, and Cyrano de Bergerac, for the war. And they head to the front lines on the Gascony border, which is in the south of France. So here we are at the Siege of Arras. So as you can see down here on this map, this is the Gascony region, that whole big yellow chunk down in the south that borders a lot of Spain. And this is really important in our play. You're going to hear Gascon, Gascony, Gascony pride, Gascony cadets come up a lot in the show. And this is referring to, of course, soldiers who were from this region and then drafted into the army during the 30 Years' War. And because of all this religious and political fragmentation, even though there was, of course, the French army, very often people were not always fighting for the, capital F French cause. And they were maybe perhaps more in it for their own geographical or regional pride, particularly because they were fighting on their very own border against the Spanish. So there was a lot of sort of pride and solidarity among people from a specific region, and of course in this case, the Gascon region is very important. So the Siege of Arras is a real siege that took place in 1640 as part of the 30 Years' War, and it happened over the course of about 3 months. So from June to August of 1640, the French troops had advanced on the Spanish border, and then their supply lines got cut off from Paris, from their capital, and the Spanish found out. And so the Spanish thought strategically, well, if we just stall long enough, we'll starve them out, because they can't possibly fight if they're hungry and tired and, of course, a long, hot summer. And so then they mounted a surprise attack, which people believe there must have been spies on the inside to give them that information, attacked the troops who were, of course, hungry and needy. But despite the odds, the French came out victorious in that siege. They suffered heavy losses, but it was a really important battle for the French soldiers just to show sort of the integrity and honor of fighting and remaining in this war. So again, we're in the Renaissance, and this hearkening back to classicism is really a hearkening back to all these traditional chivalric virtues that people really aspired to. So honor and bravery and dying for country and dying for your cause. This was paramount to anything in the world. This painting, which I've chosen, is actually not of the battle of the Siege of Arras, but rather of the Battle of Rocroi, which was another battle fought between the Spanish and the French on the Gascony border in 1643. I just liked this rendition of it. You can really see how gruesome and bloody these battle scenes were. Really, really horrific events and mass casualties all across Europe. And this battle was particularly poignant. It was a big shifting point in the war for the French army. But one little dramaturgical note about Siege of Arras. So one of my jobs as a dramaturg is to work with the cast on pronunciation and making sure that we say all of the things correctly, especially because in this play we have some French words that actually should be spoken in an English accent, we have some Spanish, some nonsense. So if you're a French speaker, you know, of course, the proper way to say this is the Siege of Arras. But if we were to say Arras with an English accent, you can understand the potential for confusion. So we have instead chosen to go with the Siege of Arras. And there you go, dramaturgy at its finest. Great, so we are going to skip forward a little more. I don't want to spoil the ending to you. Act 4 out of 5 acts takes place on the front lines of the Siege of Arras and Cyrano, so you'll have to come to the show to see what happens. But we'll go now about 250 years forward to the time of Edmond Rostand, who is the playwright of Cyrano de Bergerac. Just a sec. So obviously by the time Edmond Rostand is writing, France is a very different place. There was a revolution, don't know if you heard about it. There were about 3.5 different regimes that tried to take power after said revolution. They also didn't go so well. If you've seen or heard of Les Mis, Those events really document what was going on through all of this. So not great, but also, again, another sort of upswing towards the end of the century in terms of artistic and literary achievement. I mentioned the era has since been termed the Belle Époque. So Rostand was really writing right in the middle of this period, although Cyrano de Bergerac could be probably called a sort of belated French romantic play. And we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. But Edmond Rostand was from Marseille, France. And he was born into a pretty high-class family full of writers and artists. So he was encouraged to be a playwright from a young age. And he moved to Paris and started dabbling in dramatic works and had his first success performed at La Comédie Française, which was a really prominent French theater at the turn of the century, called Les Romanesques. So has anybody heard of the musical The Fantastics? Yeah, so The Fantastics is actually based off of this play, Les Romanesques, the Romantics, the Fantastics. Translation, we'll talk about that too. And that actually starred actress Sarah Bernhardt, so another name that might ring a bell in American audiences. So she was a French actress who eventually would move to America to continue with her acting career. But she was very friendly with young Rostand. He was 22 when he debuted Les Romanesques. And really encouraged him to keep writing. He was prone to depression. He didn't have the best physical health. And she really encouraged him to stay in the game and also introduced him to a man who would be very important to him, Constant Coquelin, who would who would originate the role of Cyrano de Bergerac in 1897. So when Rostand was just 28 years old, he debuts Cyrano de Bergerac. In 1896, and it gets put up immediately in 1897 and takes France by storm. So there has never been a play that was this successful and this unanimously popular. It was like Hamilton craze all over Paris. So very shortly after that, he was inducted into l'Académie Française as the youngest member ever, and he still holds that record. But again, he just didn't have the best of health, and he never really achieved more fame and notoriety after Cyrano. So he continued to write for the stage, but retired to the countryside shortly after 1901, and was not deemed eligible to serve for the war when World War I broke out in 1914, and he succumbed of the Spanish influenza in 1918. So that's a little bit about our playwright. And I want to talk about the source material that he was drawing from. So very much like Shakespeare, who drew from lots of different sources when he was coming up with his plots and his shows, Rostand also drew from real historical figures when he was coming up with Cyrano de Bergerac. So the real Cyrano de Bergerac was a French swordsman, dramatist, poet. He was known to have a career, but also known to have been pretty controversial in his time. His full name, Hercule Savignon Cyrano de Bergerac, is maintained in Rostand's version. So he lived from 1619 to 1655. So again, really accomplished guy, but tended to make a lot of enemies. And there is a record that he was tend to be a pretty polarizing figure. There is no mention in any historical record that his nose was of any abnormal size, shape, or form. So that is some artistic liberties being taken. But he also did have a cousin, Madeleine Roxane Robin, but there is, again, no indication that he was in love with her secretly or otherwise. In fact, quite the opposite. It was believed that Hercule Savignon Cyrano de Bergerac was a homosexual and actually had a very long-standing intimate relationship with one of his fellow playwrights for a majority of his adult life. Then, of course, the Cardinal Richelieu we've talked about was a very prominent historical and political figure in France. He's not actually a character in Rostand's play, but his sort of omnipotence is felt very much so in many of the scenes of this play, and his name is mentioned a few times, so listen out for that. And then, of course, Madeleine Roxane Robin. So this was the real-life cousin of the real Hercule Savignon Cyrano de Bergerac. But we don't know if this is actually who Rostand was basing his Roxane off of. She did marry a soldier in Cyrano's regiment named Christian de Neuvillette, and she did join a convent after her husband's death. But besides that, we don't know very much about who she was and what she was like. And therefore, scholars think that Rostand was actually basing Roxane off of another woman who was also named Roxane, conveniently, who was living around the time Rostand was and was a woman of high society, a précieuse, during the Belle Époque. And there's been a lot more written about her sort of character traits and her love of poetry and who she was as a person. So scholars think that Rostand was basing her character type off of that woman if her name is not truly Madeleine Roxane Robin. So in 1897, Cyrano De Bergerac premiered at the Porte Saint-Martin Theatre in Paris, and like I said, just exploded. And Edmond Rostand was catapulted to the limelight. And it starred Constance Coquelin, who was a really, really famous, prominent French actor at the time. He was kind of like the Richard Burbage of the Belle Époque, if that rings a bell to any of you. And one quick story I just love about this collaboration between Rostand and Coquelin. So it was said that during the last week of rehearsals, Rostand was getting cold feet, and he thought that the show was tanking. And he was sure that no one was going to like it, and he knew that all these really high, fancy, important people were slated to come for opening night. And so he was going to cancel the show. He said, "I just don't like how it ends." And so of course, his star, Constant, was like, "That is not happening." So the legend goes that he went over to Rostand's house and said, "Okay, we'll rewrite Act 5." And together they rewrote a majority of Cyrano's dialogue in the end of Act 5, which is this beautiful, sort of, long, tragic, poetic finale. And it really actually reminds me of the collaboration between Richard Burbage and Shakespeare, which is, of course, presumed, but there's a lot of textual evidence that shows that actors may have had their hands all over Shakespeare's texts. For example, we know that Richard was probably really good at delivering some breathtaking final O's. Oh, 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 oh. So there's a few versions of Hamlet that actually include that. So we might think that was a collaborative moment between the playwright and the actor, much like we think maybe the version of Act 5 we have is a collaborative effort. So anyway, he originated the role in 1897, and because the play was so popular, it was very quickly translated into a variety of languages and spread all over Europe and all over America. So in only 1 year later, in 1898, it premiered in English on Broadway, starring Richard Mansfield. And here are a few other notable Cyranos, no pun intended. On the far right, in 1923, Walter Hamden played the role in the translation done by Brian Hooker, which we'll talk about in a second. In 1946, you might recognize Jose Ferrer played the part, and again in 1950 in the film. In 1973, Christopher Plummer played Cyrano in Cyrano de Bergerac the musical, his first and last singing part. In 1983, Derek Jacobi played Cyrano at the Royal Shakespeare Company, and then in 1987, Steve Martin starred in a film entitled Roxane, which had a happy ending. So that's always looking on the bright side of life. So I want to talk to you guys about plays in translation. Because, of course, Rostand originally wrote this play in French, but we are now performing it in English. And a lot of things can get lost in translation. And it's really hard to translate a play, especially hard to translate a play written in verse or in meter. So meter, when I say meter, I mean the sort of rhythm of poetry. The reason that poetry is distinct from prose or paragraphs, the way that we just write offhand. And there's certain meters that work really well in some languages and don't work really well in other languages. So for example, as Shakespeare festival goers, you're probably aware that Shakespeare wrote most of his verse in iambic pentameter, which is a rhythm that goes da-dum, 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 da-dum. It just works really well with da-da. Okay, I can't improv iambs, but it does work really well in English, and it sounds kind of natural. There's a similar functioning meter in French called the French Alexandrine, but that's really hard to translate into English because it just doesn't work with where we emphasize syllables and where we naturally want to take breaks and pauses in our lines. So I put this example up here just to sort of show how hard it is to translate not just the meaning, but then also make sure that the verse and the meter fits. So if we have any French speakers here, you'll You'll follow right along. If not, I just want you to hear how the meter sounds, the words flow in this first iteration from Rostand's original French. De Guiche says, "On moulinait de la grande proie chargée d'étoiles, vu l'anse sans la boue. Ou bien, dans les étoiles." So great. It's a perfect Alexandrine, and there's sort of a nice little punny slant rhyme on d'étoiles and les étoiles, and it just really works in French. So a verbatim translation of that, which means word for word, might be something like, "A reel with its long arms laden with canvas will throw you into the mud. Or better, into the stars." Yeah, it's highly unremarkable. So that is why you hire a translator who does the work of not just taking the words and the meaning across, but also trying to get it into the poetic rhythm. So in 1923, Brian Hooker translated Cyrano de Bergerac, and his translation sort of became the preeminent translation for a long time in America. And this is how he did the line. It starts a little before about a windmill, but this is his version. "May swing round their huge arms and cast you down into the mire, or up among the stars." Okay, it's pretty good. It's definitely better than my verbatim translation. But as you can see, where the line breaks for Cyrano to speak and then breaks again among the stars, it doesn't quite have like a witty punchline, right? It's kind of one big line that's 3/4 finished by Cyrano. So it's pretty good, but it's not great. Now, Anthony Burgess, when he translated the play in 1970, was really critical of Brian Hooker's translation. He said, "Brian Hooker certainly succeeded in translating a play in 5 acts in verse, but completely failed at translating a comédie héroïque, a heroic comedy." So he does this version. "If you fight with windmills, they'll swing their heavy spars and spin you down to the mud, or up to the stars." So it kind of just works better in English. But that's a really sort of subtle, complex thing to do, and I think just exposes what's so challenging about doing work in translation. So that kind of leads me really nicely into this question: why Cyrano at a Shakespeare festival? And why Cyrano today? Well, to take that first question, I think when talking about plays in translation, I always think what happens the other way. What happens when we translate Shakespeare from English to another language? What if iambic pentameter doesn't work for them? What's getting lost? What are they missing? So, we grow up in the English-speaking world thinking, Shakespeare is, the father of the English language, all these hyperboles we ascribe to him. But that's not the case in a lot of other cultures that don't speak English as their primary languages. They have their own Shakespeares. They have their Rostands, their Cervantes, their Dantes, their Racines, etc. And I think it's so important as global citizens in our world to just constantly remember where we are and what we're performing. And it's truly a privilege to hear words in an original language. But then also a really fun opportunity for dialogue and cross-cultural exchange to work in translation. So that's been a joy for Chris and I to work on this script, which is our version of a translation of the original. But I think that fits really nicely into what a Shakespeare festival is trying to do. I also think that this show fits particularly well in this season's repertory of Love's Labour's Lost, Richard III, and You Can't Take It With You. All of these plays are really a celebration of language and just basking in the joy of poetry. And what happens when you do get the line right and you get the rhyme and the meter just perfect and it just fits right when you want it to. Love's Labour's Lost, if you've already seen it, it's a Shakespearean comedy. It is one of his wittiest, some of the best lines he ever wrote. Richard III, one of the most intense, amazing characters ever written, who gets his way by manipulating people through the use of rhetoric. And of course, Cyrano, his words are his biggest strength and perhaps his biggest crutch. So I just think it's really very much in the spirit of a Shakespeare festival to be putting up a production that is so celebratory of the power of language and the power of theater as a means to communicate that language. And then, of course, why now? Why Cyrano in 2018? So I will be perfectly candid with you all. I study feminist theory, queer theory, and Shakespeare. So when I was told that I was working on the one non-Shakespeare show at the Shakespeare Festival, I was like, what? And especially one that sort of on the surface seems like it might reinforce a lot of the heteronormative, patriarchal, misogynistic behaviors that we right now are finding firsthand can be very, very damaging and problematic in our society on mass scales. And I was really sort of grappling with, okay, how are we going to approach this play? And we're setting it in time and place, and what do we do? And this is, of course, just one of those great moments that you turn to your director for inspiration. And Chris wrote this really beautiful, I guess, speech he gave to our cast on the first day of rehearsals last week that said, we need this play now more than ever, because we are watching good men fall from grace, and we are watching decent men fall further into disgrace. And we don't know what it means to be a good man today. And we don't know what it means to be a good person today. And I hadn't thought about the play quite like that. And, you know, it's cliche to say there's a Cyrano in all of us, and there's, you know, some good and some bad. But this play is so raw. That's a word that's come up a lot in our rehearsal, is exposed. This play doesn't let you run away from that. This play doesn't let you sort of cower behind what confronting those feelings and those problems mean. And I think seeing that and seeing it done aggressively and authentically and just beautifully by this company of actors that the Shakespeare Festival has assembled for us to work with is really important and can absolutely teach us something. So I have been learning a tremendous amount in the rehearsal room this past week. I am certain it will be thought-provoking and touching, and well, I'll let you insert the blank when you come to see the production. So with that, I will just wrap up and give one more plug to come see the show, please. It opens July 6th, or rather, it opens July 7th, but there is a final preview you can get tickets to on July 6th, runs through the 11th, and yeah, you can get tickets by calling the box office or online. And we have about 10 more minutes, so I'm happy to field some questions. I don't want to put Chris too much on the spot, but if you have anything, especially fight choreography related, I would direct that his way. But thank you guys so much for being here.